Where I live, we have quite a good quality of life compared to other parts of the world. The government requires us to recycle 70% of our waste by 2025. The good news is that the local authority has just won an award for the best recycling and waste team in the country. 63% of all waste is recycled, which begs the question, what happens to the other 37%? Well, after diligent research, I can now tell you how we dispose of it. I don't think the council were aware of the consequences of using the mode of waste disposal shown in this picture. I knew a guy who used to work for the Ford Motor Company, and he harassed his suppliers so much about taking cost out of the process they resorted to this mode of transport. Seriously though, it's important we understand the relationship between quality and risk, and to illustrate it, I'm going to talk about some risky ventures. The terminology and how we get our head around it. You might be surprised to learn of the risks that were already identified in the 2008 version, and I'll introduce you to uncertainty and risk-based thinking. How we will identify risks using 9001, 2015, and finally, I'll show you that the standard does address risk management despite the claims the authors make that it doesn't. The first risky venture I'd like to talk to you about is one that began 175 years ago. I chose Cunard to represent success in service quality management, not only because I worked for them in the late 1960s, and I've since travelled on their new ships, but because they have stuck to their values in a risky market. Samuel Cunard held a strong belief in safety over speed, and this has been passed down through the generations of captains. Cunard made ocean liners a success in the face of many potential rivals who lost ships and fortunes, implying that the quality of the decision-making was good. The next risky venture is taken from the automotive industry. The Ford Transit, launched in 1965, which has been the best-selling light commercial vehicle in Europe for 49 years. And this has been brought about by continual improvement, another example where the quality of decision-making was good. A very risky venture was the first moon landing in 1969, which was a success despite not knowing the hardness of the landing surface, and hence another example where the quality of the decision-making was good. However, there have been some pretty catastrophic failures in risk-taking. Take the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of 1986. Now a famous case study. Disintegration of the vehicle began after an O-ring seal in its right solid rocket booster failed at liftoff. NASA managers had known about a potential catastrophic flaw in the O-ring since 1977. They also disregarded warnings from engineers about the dangers of launching posed by the low temperatures of that morning, and failed to adequately report these technical concerns to their superiors. Bob Ebling from Thickle said, "We're only qualified to 40 degrees. What business does anyone even have thinking about 18 degrees? We're in no man's land." Quality of the decision making on this case was poor. Another failure in risk-taking was in 2008, when the Royal Bank of Scotland exposed itself to risks it lacked the capability to manage. Overconfidence, a can-do attitude, and the notion that we are much more sophisticated and smarter than our predecessors led to the downfall of RBS. Obsessed with takeovers and trivia, the chief executive officer paid too little attention to the old-fashioned fundamentals of banking and paid the price, but alas, he left with a golden handshake and a gigantic pension fund. The quality of decision-making in this case was also poor. The third example I have concerns the Deepwater Horizon disaster of 2010, which was caused by a failure of a cement barrier allowing hydrocarbons to flow up the wellbore. The US district judge ruled BP was guilty of gross negligence and willful misconduct under the Clean Water Act. He described BP's actions as reckless and apportioned 67% of the blame for the spill to BP, 30% to Transocean and 3% to Halliburton. Again, the quality of decision making was poor. Quality management, as perceived by renowned systems thinker Russ Ackoff, is a way of managing an organization that increases the quality of its outputs. I use this explanation in preference to the definition in ISO 9000, as it's much easier to get your head around. We would therefore not be able to manage quality if we didn't have an acute awareness of risks and how to manage them. You can't manage quality without also managing risk, but you can manage risk without also managing quality. All it takes is to become a person who does nothing. Doing stuff, therefore, involves taking risks. I'd like to share with you some perceptions about what risk is. Risk is perceived to be a potential situation that you'd like to avoid or encourage. Exposure to the possibility of loss, injury, or other adverse or unwelcome circumstances. That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. A combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. That's from ISO Guide 50. The effect of uncertainty on objectives, where an effect is a deviation from the expected, positive or negative. That's from the ISO Risk Management Standard 31000. A state of uncertainty, where some of the possibilities involve loss, harm, injury, catastrophe, or other undesirable outcomes. That is from Douglas Hubbard, eminent writer on risk management. There are several proverbs on the theme of risk, which may be familiar to us. For example, when the wind blows, some people build bunkers, others build windmills. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Throw caution to the wind. Commenting on the first of these proverbs, I would say that a blowing wind is a phenomenon. It becomes a risk if it affects what you are intending to do, and therefore it is a risk to those whose objectives require calm, but it is an opportunity to those whose objectives require the wind to blow. Eric Winkle-Brown, Navy test pilot in World War II and throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, said to Kirsty Young on Desert Island Discs shortly before his death at the age of 97, that there was always that aura of risk. You came to value life in a different sort of way, and he always made a point of preparing himself very well indeed before a flight. Kirsty suggested that kick the tires, light the fires, last one off's a sissy was not his motto, and that he had a different approach, and he said that sort of attitude cost an awful lot of lives. People who take risks are therefore not necessarily reckless. In fact, we would not be here today had our ancestors not taken risks. So risk-taking should be considered to be normal behavior. It's all a matter of the quality of the thinking you do first as to whether it's reckless. When faced with uncertainty, we have choices. Imagine you and your friend decide to go down to Brighton for lunch at the weekend. You have a choice of routes and modes of transport. You agree you need to get there by 12:30. You can avoid the risk by not going at all, reduce the risk by using a safer and more reliable mode of transport than you currently own, transfer the risk by selecting public transport, or accept the risk by using your own vehicle, which hasn't broken down recently. Rather depends on whether you are risk averse or risk tolerant. You weigh up the potential benefits and harms of exercising one choice over another. You need the wisdom to know the difference between the things we can influence and those we can't. Risk always relates to a potentially unwelcome circumstance. Some people say risk is neutral, meaning it's neither positive nor negative, as though risk is a consequence, ignoring the fact that it's only a possibility of something happening. According to ISO 31000, risk is effect of uncertainty on objectives, where an effect is a deviation from the expected, positive or negative. Some people interpret this as implying that risk can be positive or negative, but this is not so. It's the deviation that may be positive or negative relative to an expectation. But beware, deviations have consequences. Can risk be positive? The simple answer is no, it can't. Is there an upside of risk? No, but there might be a benefit from taking a risk. Is the risk of not pursuing an opportunity a positive risk? No, but it might be a mistake. It is not that risk can be positive, but that uncertainty may be positive or negative. Just as in the proverb I mentioned earlier, that the uncertainty of the wind blowing tomorrow is a risk to those whose objectives require calm and is therefore a negative uncertainty, but it is an opportunity to those whose objectives require the wind to blow and is therefore a positive uncertainty. Let's now look at the risks and ISO 9001-2008. All requirements presently in ISO 9001 may be perceived as prescribed risk treatments because these requirements evolved to prevent situations occurring that have previously resulted in poor quality. You've therefore already treated most of the risks by putting in place prevention or control measures. Let's look at some examples from the 2008 version to illustrate the point. Planning. We plan in order to reduce the risk of not achieving an objective. Design control. We institute control over design in order to reduce the risk of producing products and services having characteristics customers don't want. Training. We provide training in order to reduce the risk of human error. Standards. We establish standards in order to reduce the risk of producing or supplying the wrong product or service. Measurement. We undertake measurements in order to reduce the risk of releasing something that isn't right. Document control. We institute document control in order to reduce the risk of losing valid documents and using invalid documents. Improvement. We undertake improvement in order to reduce the risk of customers taking their business elsewhere. Corrective action. We undertake corrective action in order to reduce the risk of problems recurring. And preventive action. We undertake preventive action in order to reduce the risk of decisions adversely affecting quality, cost and delivery. Therefore, select a requirement and ask, we do this to reduce the risk of what? We'll now take a look at Clause 6.1 in ISO 9001-2015. ISO have removed the preventive action clause in all management system standards and merged the requirements with a clause on risk. This new clause states, when planning for the QMS, determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed, and there's a list of things. It is important to read this requirement carefully because planning for the QMS is not the same as planning the QMS. These are extrinsic risks and opportunities, those having their source external to the QMS. Remember, at this stage, the QMS does not exist, and it is being planned, so it is not suggesting you do an FMEA on the QMS. So, continuing. You need to determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed to give assurance that the quality management system can achieve its intended results. And this means that those results include products and services that consistently meet customer and applicable regulatory requirements. You also need to determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed to enhance desirable effects, prevent or reduce undesirable effects, and achieve improvement. Leaders operate in the realm of bewildering uncertainty and staggering complexity. Today's problems arise from yesterday's solutions, and today's solutions become tomorrow's problems because there is often a long delay between the cause and the effect. Right up to the 1970s, one simple relationship was sufficient to explain all relationships, and that was cause and effect. But it's more complex than that. Success in this environment requires different ways of thinking. The machine age might have propelled us into the 1970s, but as we are now well into the 21st century, is the machine age behind us? Imagine a system composed of a driver and a car. If the driver decides to run the car into the wall, the car will hit the wall without any objection, implying the car hasn't any means of influencing the driver to take a different course of action. The driver is an animated system, which is single-minded and progresses through command and control. The whole has a choice, but the parts don't. However, the same is not true for a system composed of a horse and a rider. If a rider decides to jump a horse over a wall, success depends upon the bond between the horse and the rider. The combination of horse and rider represents a social system, which is multi-minded and progresses through consultation and cooperation. Both the parts and the whole have a choice. Those managers who perceive they are driving their organization towards some goal soon realize that they need the cooperation of their workers to achieve it. Treat the workers badly and their endeavors will be thwarted. Hence, one cannot treat the organization as if it were a machine. It's composed of people, each with the ability to choose what is in its best interest. There are different types of thinking: holistic thinking, analytical thinking, causal thinking, statistical thinking, vertical thinking, horizontal thinking, linear thinking, etc. It follows that to improve the action, we have to first improve the thinking. As Tom Grunstrom, VP Integrated Process and Technology, says, it's not just doing the right things, but thinking the right things long before we ever get going. It's knowing what we depend upon to achieve our objectives. It's anticipating what could go wrong, and it's also anticipating what could go wrong by pursuing a particular risk treatment. It's therefore weighing up the potential benefits and harms of exercising one choice over another, and knowing the difference between the things we can influence and those we can't. As Nancy Klein says, everything we do depends for its quality on the thinking we do first. An uncertainty presents a risk if its occurrence may have a negative effect on an expected result. An uncertainty presents an opportunity if its occurrence may have a positive effect on an expected result. To illustrate the point, imagine you are travelling to Brighton and have taken the motorway, and you are uncertain whether you will avoid any obstacles that may delay your arrival. There weren't any roadworks or accidents, so you'll get there on time. Or you'll receive a traffic alert of delays ahead. You seize the opportunity to exit the motorway and you get to Brighton on time. If you lose your shirt, you can buy another, but if you lose your life, you can't. There are several types of uncertainty. There's the uncertainty of whether the potential events will happen or not. Example, the failure event, road closure, equipment malfunction. There's also the uncertainty of being presented with a range of possible results, such as a variation in time, cost, quantity, and quality. Then there's the uncertainty in knowledge, whether there are things we know we don't know and things that we should know that arise from honesty, ignorance, or ineptitude. Example, the hardness of the moon's surface or the difference between knowledge and belief. represented by only knowing if a chair is safe to sit on after I or someone else sits on it. And finally, there are the unknowns. The things we could not possibly know about because they are outside our frame of reference. What are referred to as the black swans, because an accepted norm was that all swans were white until black swans were discovered in New Zealand. These may be manifested by discontinuous changes. Uncertainty exists at various levels, and in general, the higher the level, the more significant it is. There is the enterprise level, represented by corporate, region, country, site, and division. Such uncertainties potentially impact the whole organization. At the operational level, uncertainties potentially impact individual business units, contract, projects, processes, product, services, and components. However, in organizations that provide only one product or service, uncertainties at the operational level can have a devastating impact on the whole organization. Examples being air and rail transport, environmental disasters. There are also internal and external sources of uncertainty. The uncertainty referred to in clause 6.1 is from external sources, but that referred to in clause 5.1.2 is from internal sources. The internal sources include those which the organization is exposed to because of what it chooses to do, with whom it chooses to do it, and where it chooses to do it, such as the market, the financial risks, the product and service risks, innovation, supply chain risks, employee risks. The external sources include those that the organization has little or no influence over, such as legislation, the natural environment, technology, politics, economics, and the competition. We can begin our journey of discovery either from the smallest component of the product or the service and work upwards looking for potential causes of failure, or we can begin with a much broader canvas and investigate how choices made in the particular areas can impact the quality of products and services provided. Another approach is to use causal loops to reveal the interactions between various variables, asking what happens to product quality if this variable increases or decreases, and then estimating the probability of that happening. You don't do risk analysis on every risk. There will be uncertainties that are highly likely but have very little impact, so any effort trying to mitigate them outweighs the value to be gained. There will also be those uncertainties that are highly unlikely, but were they to materialize, they will be devastating for the whole organization. These uncertainties may range from a flat battery or an ill-conceived tweet, which, were they to happen, may result in nothing more than a service glitch. To the more serious, untimely service outage that loses customers and the product recall which tarnishes an otherwise unblemished reputation, to the total failure of strategy which results in bankruptcy. Product and service risks may be classified in three ways. There are risks associated with the quality of design, such as the risk that the market intelligence is wrong, or a risk that the design fails to reflect what the market or customer wanted. Then there are risks associated with the quality of conformity, such as the risk that the product or service does not conform to its specification. And lastly, there are risks that are associated with the quality of use, such as the risk that the product or service ceases to conform to its specification in use. With processes, there are risks such as the risk that a process will produce non-conforming product or services, the risk that a process will cause a health, safety, or environmental hazard, or other losses, the risk that the data or information on which the decisions will be made are not of high integrity, errors, incomplete, or ambiguous, the risk that data are vulnerable to cybercrime, the risk that a process will not detect inputs of inferior quality, or a risk that the people involved lack adequate understanding or aptitude. With all these, one should always endeavour to keep the effort spent on mitigating risk less than the value at risk. At the system level, there may be a risk that the short-term decisions taken are not the right ones for the business and its stakeholders, a risk that the system will produce unintended outcomes, and a risk that the interactions between people will reinforce undesirable behaviours. These risks are difficult to predict, let alone identify. It is often with hindsight that top management become aware of the risks they were taking. There is no requirement in ISO 9001:2015 for formal risk management, just like there is no formal requirement for quality management, but there are requirements which, if met, result in the management of risk. ISO 31000 addresses risk management and identifies the following elements, which have corresponding clauses in ISO 9001. Determine the context, which is addressed by clause 4.1 of ISO 9001. And as a result, you answer the question, what are you trying to do, why, and who cares? Identify risk, which is addressed by clauses 6.1 and 5.1.2 of the standard. And as a result, you answer the question, what could go wrong? Risk analysis, which is addressed by clauses 6.1, 6.3, 8.1, 833, 855 and 10.2, simply by searching in ISO 9001 where the words likelihood and consequence are used. Evaluate risk, which is addressed by clause 6.1.2, and as a result answer the question, to what extent are the risks manageable? Treat risk, which is also addressed by clause 6.1.2, and as a result you declare how you will avoid, transfer, reduce or accept the identified risks. Review process, which is addressed by clause 9.3.2e, and as a result you answer the question, were the actions taken and did they work? But a cynical view is that we cannot predict the future with any certainty, and therefore risk management is an activity to persuade others that if things go wrong, it is not management's fault. Finally, I'll leave you with a word from Mary Poppins. A British bank must be run with precision. A British home requires nothing less. Tradition, discipline and rules must be the tools. Without them, disorder, chaos, moral disintegration. In short, you have a ghastly mess. A wise course of action will be to learn from Mary Poppins and not Braveheart. Mind how you go. And should you have any questions, please submit them by email to the address here. Thank you.